Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar, NEM Reforms and Who Rules the Market. This is the first in a series of very important webinars and podcasts that have been put forward, suggested by and supported by Paul Curnow and his team at Ashurst. We're going to be looking at some serious issues such as the challenge of zero emissions, the opportunities of green hydrogen, and many other things. But this first webinar, I think, is a very important one, and who rules the market? And I think we've got the timing on this just about right, because there's already more than 2,200 registrations for this webinar, which is fantastic. So thanks everyone for joining. Of course, just the last week, the Energy Security Board has released the detailed advice that's given to the state energy ministers and the federal energy minister about what they think are the right proposals for the post-2025 market. I think the whole industry has been on the field and playing in their favourite colours, and now we've finally decided what the rules of the game are going to be. So that's the topic of the day, and I'm delighted to welcome, well, we've got a fantastic panel lining up here. We have the New South Wales Energy Minister, Matt Keane, we have the AEMC Chair, Anna Collier, and we have the Investors Representative, Simon Corbell. Now, the format is that Paul is going to lead the panelists through a discussion for about the first half of the webinar, and then we're going to have a Q&A from you out there, which I'm going to help moderate with Paul. Now, because there are going to be so many people online, and let's have a look at it now. We're heading up towards 1,000 people already. So there's going to be lots of questions. Don't hold back. We'll sift through them and we'll try and get to as many of them as we can. But look, before we go any further, I'd just like to welcome all the panelists, thank everybody out there for attending, and hand over to Paul Curnow from Ashurst.
Thanks, Charles, and it's great to be here. Paul Curnow, partner in Ashurst, and I'm one of the global co-heads for energy with Ashurst. So welcome again, as Giles mentioned, to this Energy Transform webinar and podcast series, which we're going to be rolling out over the next 4 months in partnership with Renew Economy, and touching on all the challenges and opportunities across Australia's energy transition. As Giles mentioned, today we're going to focus on the ESB reforms for NEM 2025. And the question is, when it comes to NEM reforms, who rules the market? I'll introduce the panelists shortly, more formally. And as Giles mentioned, we're fortunate to have the release of the ESB final recommendations just last week to the energy, that's gone to the energy ministers, as well as AEMO's latest electricity statement opportunities released just yesterday. So perfect timing, as Giles mentioned, for diving into this really important discussion. Before I start, I just want to welcome everyone, and then to acknowledge the First Nations peoples as the traditional custodians of the land on which we work in Australia, and in particular on the land in which our clean energy future is being built. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I meet you virtually today, here in Sydney, on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to extend respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples across Australia, and their connections to land, sea and community. As Giles mentioned, you're on mute. We have a Q&A function, so you can definitely communicate with us. So please add questions as we go through, and about halfway through, we'll start feeding those questions through our panelists. So before I formally introduce the panelists, I just want to quickly set the scene. I think it's worth just reminding ourselves exactly the enormity of what the ESB paper is covering, and I guess the challenge that lies before us. The very first sentence in the ESB report says it's difficult to overstate the scale and pace of change across Australia's electricity sector, as both large and small scale renewable generation enters this system rapidly and in volume. And I think it's equally difficult to overstate the policy and legal complexity of trying to reform the NEM during such a period of high disruption and rapid change. And I think it's important at this point just to pause and reflect, despite the debate and differences that we will be having, on the incredible hard work of the ESB and its various team members who've been grappling with these complex system and market issues over many months. So as you'll know from the paper, there's 4 reform pathways that are set out and which will now be deliberated on by the Energy Ministers and National Cabinet in the coming months. Resource adequacy mechanism in the context of retiring aging thermal generators is obviously one of the critical ones. We all know the key issue here that's facing the market over the next 10 to 15 years, with the NEM rapidly transitioning to a low emissions profile, with up to 29 gigawatts of large and small scale variable renewable capacity to be built by 2030 alone. At the same time, 50% reduction in existing baseload capacity. This reform pathway is focused on delivering new market-based approaches to explicitly value capacity, which of course is a step change from our current NEM energy-only market, but it's there to provide an investable, enduring long-term signal for the competitive provision of right mix of capacity. And so we've seen the ESB recommend a capacity mechanism that's received a lot of media attention of late, which no doubt we'll dive into as part of our discussion. The second reform pathway is around essential system services and scheduling and ahead mechanisms to ensure that those essential system services, frequency control, operating reserves, inertia, and system strength are available to maintain system security. With that 29 gigawatts of variable renewable energy coming on over the next 10 years and the expected exit of synchronous generation, these essential system services that were traditionally provided by those synchronous generation as a byproduct of energy are no longer provided in abundance. And so the power system of the NEM will need to be able to accommodate periods of either high or very high or very low instantaneous penetration of renewables. And so as a result, new market-based arrangements are better required to value these services. There's a lot of immediate reform that's been underway by the AMC on frequency, including very recent fast frequency response rule, and then initial reforms looking at inertia, operating reserves and system strength, and maybe in time looking at ahead markets. The third pathway is around distributed energy resources. And as you'll see from the report, there's the ESB notes that the largest generator in NEM is now owned collectively by customers, and that's sitting on our rooftops. Gigawatts of installed solar PV across close to 3 million homes, and whose rapid growth continues to outstrip all forecasts. So this pathway is centered around a detailed distributed energy resource implementation plan aimed at integrating the necessary evolution of regulatory roles and responsibilities across the system into a suite of technical, market and regulatory reforms over the next 4 years. And the final reform pathway is around transmission access to ensure timely transmission investment, better use of capacity on the network, and reduce uncertainty for the private sector by making future patterns of congestion more predictable. So this is really focused around delivering better signals to generators to locate in areas where available generation capacity is best, namely in renewable energy zones, to be delivered through AEMO's integrated system plan and state government policies. And at the same time, the reform pathway focuses on reducing ongoing uncertainty for investors through measures that give more predictability to generators and investors have access to the grid and future congestion. And here the ESB has proposed a congestion management model, which we'll also be discussing. So all in all, a big package of reforms and a lot for all of us as market participants to engage with and to consider. And so to discuss the challenges and opportunities presented by these, I'm pleased to introduce formally leading energy maker policymakers, and clean energy advocates. So I'd like to welcome the Minister for Energy Environment, the Honourable Matt Kean. Welcome, Minister. The Minister took his post as Energy Environment Minister in April 2019, has been a member for Hornsby and the New South Wales Legislative Assembly from March 2011. In his time as Minister, he has championed strong action on clean energy and climate, leading New South Government's work in planning and legislating the New South Wales Energy Infrastructure Roadmap, an ambitious coordinated framework to deliver a modern electricity system for New South Wales, introducing 5 renewable energy zones with up to 12 gigawatts of new renewables and storage capacity over the next decade. I'd also like to welcome Anna Collier, the Chair of the Australian Energy Market Commission. Anna is a leading energy expert, formerly Head of Innovation and partner with law firm Allens, and more than 2 decades of experience advising a range of clients in the energy sector and working extensively on industry reform. Anna was appointed as chair of the AMC in November last year and took up a position in February this year. And I remember chatting with Anna recently when she mentioned that the AMC is working on something like 40 different rules. So extremely busy time and lots to discuss. And finally, I'd like to introduce and welcome Simon Corbell, who's the board chair and chief executive officer of the Clean Energy Investor Group. Simon is well known to many of you in the market in his previous roles as the Victorian Renewable Energy Advocate, but perhaps most notably for his work as the Minister of Environment, Climate Change and Energy for the ACT government in driving the ACT's 100% renewables target. In his current role, Simon represents developers of clean energy institutional investors with a combined generation portfolio of 11 gigawatts across more than 70 power stations and a combined portfolio value of around 24 billion. And the CEIG has recently released a report calling on the adoption of 5 key investor principles, which we'll also be talking about. So with that introduction, I'd like to now turn to some questions to open up the debate. And so first question to you, Minister, and thanks again for joining. Looking at the New South Wales Energy Infrastructure Roadmap, it's clear that the design of it has had an eye to some of these NEM reforms as recommended by the ESB. With the release of the final recommendations last week, I guess a lot of market participants are still asking themselves, how do these state-based approaches and legislative interventions line up with the NEM reforms in the short, medium and longer term? And I guess everyone's keen to understand, how do you see the New South Wales Energy Roadmap converging with and supporting the ESB reforms?
Well, thank you very much. It is a great question and certainly something that we've considered very closely when designing our roadmap. Firstly, let me say the roadmap was designed to integrate with the NEM, not work against it. And if you look closely at the ESB's post-2025 report, the board has recommended a number of reforms that build on the New South Wales roadmap. So take, for example, the principles for jurisdictional schemes and the renewable energy zones framework. So these proposals align very well with the work that we've been doing here in New South Wales for the past few years. So we're going to continue to work very closely with the ESB to make sure that our reforms continue to work alongside the national reforms and to drive better outcomes across the NEM. But look, I can hear your frustrations and the frustrations of those on the call that a fragmented approach to dealing with the NEM is not the best way, but I can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I've got my own challenges here in New South Wales to keep the lights on, drive prices down and set our economy up for that low carbon future that we know is coming, whether Canberra likes it or not, and we've got to crack on with it. But as I said, we've designed this program to make sure that it integrates with the NEM, not work against it.
Yeah, so I think that, as I said, that's clear when you look at a number of the features of the roadmap. And I guess we'll pick this up a little bit, I think, when we start to talk about some of the transmission and access issues as well. But just a follow-on question to that, I mean, if you think about the package of reforms and your roadmap, how do you see that as going to be enough certainty direction to encourage the private sector back into the market to really scale up their investing? As we've seen from Simon's group, there are real concerns about the ability of our market to attract the long-term capital that we need, which no doubt we'll hear from Simon shortly. But just keen to get your sense of and I know from the consultation there's been a lot of discussion with investors around to what extent the reforms and the roadmap are really delivering that longer-term certainty.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely we do. I mean, we designed the roadmap with investors front of mind. That's what this is about. It's about encouraging people to be able to invest their capital here in New South Wales with confidence and not see it, those investments being eroded because MLFs and things like that we've seen in the past. So this is all about ensuring that the roadmap is based on providing that long-term certainty to investors. I mean, that will help get the capital costs down, which will also help get then cost down to consumers. So we absolutely think that this is about supporting investment and not driving it away.
So Simon, can I bring you in here? Because I think it was just 2 weeks ago you released your report calling on sort of the adoption of 5 clean energy investment principles in order to unlock low-cost capital, particularly global capital, in which Australia competes amongst many other clean energy markets. I guess I'm keen to sort of hear more about those, but in particular, your principle 2, which was advocating sort of a redesign for governance and a new accord for NEM governance. So in light of that, I mean, do you see the ESB reforms going in the right direction?
Well, I think it is striking, Paul, that we haven't seen very significant recommendations for wholesale governance reform in the ESB paper. And we would say as an investor body that that is important and needed because fundamentally the way the NEM has been developed and in terms of governance is based on the consensus of the focus on privatisation and efficiency in the 1990s. And we are now planning for a system that's fundamentally focused on transformation of the market. And that means we do need to think more broadly about the overarching goals that we have for the market in that new context of transformation, not incremental change. So we've highlighted as an investor group that a number of issues that we think ministers should have regard to. The first is to look at a new electricity transition agreement to replace the Australian Energy Market Agreement, which would recognise collectively that governments agree we are planning for transformation, we need to govern for transformation, and we need to focus on that in the context of not just efficient development of the NEM, but also focusing on the need to recognise that the NEM serves a broader public policy function in terms of the environmental objectives that we have as a nation and for our economy overall. So, for example, we recommend that there should be a environmental objective added to the national electricity objective, because one of the challenges we have at the moment is that the market bodies have regard to the NEO when they are making decisions around everything from regulatory investment test frameworks through to how they prioritise the orderly organisation of the market on a day-to-day basis through the energy market operator. So not having an environmental objective means that when you look at, for example, a new transmission development, you don't have regard to will this transmission development help secure and accelerate the decarbonisation of elements of the NEM in line with our broader international obligations. So we believe there are a range of reasons why adding an environmental objective to the NEO is important. We also say that we need a pragmatic and proactive approach from the market bodies. There's been a lot of focus on design of rules and mechanisms that is still very much grounded in a fairly theoretical economic perspective, and they don't always align with the lived in reality of investors. Investors need clarity and certainty if they are to be able to proceed with confidence. And we would say that we need to recognise that disconnect that sometimes exists between the market bodies and the lived reality of investors and align our rule-changing approaches to have regard to that. So there is significant opportunities when it comes to redesigning governance for transformation, and that's certainly one of the key principles we've outlined in our Clean Energy Investor Principles report we released last week.
So just then, Anna, I want to bring you in here because I guess when you obviously if you look at the ESB reforms, there's a lot for the AMC to do, a lot of recommendations for rules to be now worked through, additional rules beyond the many that you're already working on. And I think Simon's point picks up on a sort of a tension that I sort of see in the market between those expecting and advocating sort of more immediate, broader reforms, as Simon's suggesting, perhaps with the new agreement, versus, I guess, what I see when I read the ESB is a more naturally incremental process when you think of the existing regulatory setup. And I guess, you know, the ESB talks about immediate, initial and longer term as part of those reform pathways. But at the same time, the ESB acknowledges that this will take years and that policy reform and rulemaking needs to remain dynamic in response to technology, pricing and other market changes. So given those tensions, do you see a different way, the AMC is going to have sort of a different way to rulemaking? You know, and how can the AMC provide sort of more certainty and guidance as that regulatory direction, given its current function?
Thanks very much, Paul. I've got two sort of introductory comments to make, and then I'll get to how we're seeing our role at the AEMC evolving in the current context. So the first one is to observe that this is not an issue that's unique to the energy sector. And you mentioned in the introduction my role as head of innovation at Allens, and one of the things I did there that I was really proud of was to form a partnership with the University of New South Wales Law School. And they were looking at this exact question, like how does law and regulation keep up with rapidly changing technology and the innovation that comes along with that. And of course, they would be looking at it in the context of artificial intelligence or the proliferation of data. But to me, it really did speak to the energy sector as well. And it was the exact kind of issues that we're grappling with now, is how you not only keep up with, but get ahead of this massive change when you don't have a crystal ball and you can't see the future. The second point is that we don't have a clean sheet of paper or a standing start. Like we're an energy sector in motion, and it's sort of almost like we're on a moving car. We're trying to jump onto the aeroplane. We're still building the aeroplane. And that's just the reality of where we are. And so the ESB work really is about a transformational change, but it's looking at an actual manageable way of moving forward in that environment where we actually do need to keep serving customers and make sure that the lights stay on. So from an AEMC perspective, we've actually just been working on a new strategic plan, which will be launched shortly. And we really are focusing on the way that we go about our work. And there's three things which actually line up with what the Minister and Simon have already spoken about. The first one is that idea of being forward-looking and having a future vision so that you do have that sense of direction in which you're moving. And I think that's very much what the ESB report seeks to do, is to set out that longer-term vision and give that sense of this is where we want to go with our reform. But then the second thing is to take these implementable and pragmatic steps to get towards that. And I really wanted to pick up that notion of being more pragmatic, because again, that's something that we're really focused on. We've sort of heard the feedback about being very technically orientated. And I have to say, I do believe that solid technical economic analysis should be the starting point, but then understanding how that plays out in reality, and particularly in this rapidly changing space, is obviously critical to making reform that actually gets you the answer that you want to get. And I think that we've been demonstrating in a couple of our recent pieces of work that we're prepared to kind of pause and go, well, if that didn't work, we need to kind of change and not be kind of caught up in just maintaining a direction just for the sake of it. The third thing that's really important and really focused on is that idea of collaboration and sort of working really closely with stakeholders. And the thing that's really struck me since starting in this role is that everyone in the energy sector is really passionate about improving the sector, but everyone has really different ideas about what the best way is to do that. And so in some ways, I see the role of the AEMC is trying to navigate through that diversity and harness the benefit that you get from really different perspectives so that we do get those great outcomes for customers. So those are the kind of the three things that we are really focusing on in the way that we work towards making rules that will start to really make a difference in this rapidly changing environment.
Maybe just to Simon or the Minister, if you wanted to sort of add any comments there.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I just wanted to respond to a couple of points that Simon made, and I understand that that ideally we should add environmental objectives to the NEM, but we can't chase the perfect over the good. That's held us back for so long as it is. We need to crack on with building the critical infrastructure that is needed now, like the transmission for the renewable energy zones. And our roadmap legislation clearly identifies the importance of sustainability alongside reliability and affordability. With regard to concerns about the market bodies, we have had a changing of the guard at the market bodies, and in particular, a huge warm welcome to Anna today, who is, I'm so excited about her coming on board. I mean, she is just exactly what we need to drive the change that we all want to see. But the ESB's made some great progress in bringing together a comprehensive reform package to energy ministers. And I think that is evidence of practical collaboration in a way that is in what is a highly contested space. So I'm not as pessimistic as Simon. I think we're moving in the right direction, and I'm going to keep encouraging my friends in Canberra in the Morrison government to do so.
Simon, I'm sure you...
Yeah. I must say, I wouldn't say I'm pessimistic, but I would say I'm ambitious. And I think we need to be ambitious for the future of the NEM. And we should always recognise that the intersection between energy policy and climate policy is critical. It is critical. Is it a case of making the perfect the enemy of the good? I accept Matt's point. I accept the minister's point that is something that we do have to recognise pragmatically as we navigate, particularly in the context of a federal system and the respective roles and responsibilities of the different parts of government. But that doesn't mean, as an investor body, that we believe we should shy away from talking about those things that we believe are important for decision makers to have regard to. Are we saying that that is a condition precedent for unlocking low-cost capital? Not on its own, no. But it is part of a broader suite of reforms that we say decision makers should have regard to, because we do need to recognise that in the market at the moment, Australia experiences a very significant cost premium for investment in new build renewables. That is the reality. Our investor members have told us collectively that that's probably around 100 to 250 basis points in terms of cost of equity for new build projects. Now, that is a significant cost premium that we need to work to remove. And it is the case that when you look at the New South Wales roadmap, that has, as the minister says, very clearly focused on that objective. And as an investor body, we have welcomed the roadmap because it does provide the long-term contracting arrangements that will bring down the cost of capital and the cost of equity for projects. And it will also assist with delivering firmer access arrangements, particularly in renewable energy zone development. So for all of those reasons, these are important reforms and we welcome them at the state level. But we are also talking about the design of the NEM overall. And we are also talking about a need to try and retain a coherent sense of what the NEM should look like, because investors will continue to look at Australia as a market overall, and they will continue to look at whether they should be deploying their funds into Australian projects or into projects in Europe or North America or parts of Asia. And at the moment, investors, unfortunately, are sending a signal that there is a level of risk and uncertainty in the Australian market that makes it more expensive for investment to occur. And that is a cost that we economically and individually as consumers should be doing everything to try and avoid.
So just on that theme, you mentioned that you welcome the New South Wales Energy Roadmap, which I think many people do. Do you see that, particularly with the Tessa auction and the way that sort of be rolled out in the next 10 years to really make sure as a safeguard in that generation build, do you see that as sort of addressing some of those issues in terms of that mismatch between pricing here?
Yes, so the Tessa arrangements, obviously we're still seeing the detail of that, and we're grateful for the engagement we've had with the New South Wales Department and with the Minister directly on these issues. It's been a very proactive engagement program. But the Tessa framework does deliver a high level of certainty. It provides the right level of contract term, and it delivers a level of revenue certainty that investors are looking for. So obviously the New South Wales government is also focused on how they will address risk from their perspective and to ensure that there is the lowest amount of impact as possible on consumers, and that is appropriate for a government to focus on. But certainly from an investor perspective, we think that the steps taken by New South Wales government and equally steps taken by a number of other governments, whether it's in Victoria through the VRED auction environment, or whether it's Queensland in their contracting through CleanCo, or indeed the ACT's most recent contracting, are all delivering a level of price certainty and low cost renewables and a reasonable level of revenue certainty in a way that we're not seeing in the broader NEM in terms of wholesale markets.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember that one of the great things about the NEM that's driven everything we've seen to date, notwithstanding these challenges, is that ability to financially hedge and position in the market. And I think, you know, these sorts of instruments have been really critical to actually drive a lot of that certainty. And of course, there's nothing about the NEM as it is now that doesn't prevent that. So I think that's a really good good point. I want to sort of move on now to a couple of other themes that we've picked up from my introduction. And I guess look at perhaps one of the most fundamental of the ESB's recommendation in terms of what would amount to quite a big step change, namely the introduction of a capacity market. I think, yeah, we've all seen the headlines in recent weeks on what that might, or views on what that means. But I think it's also worth looking at the electricity statement of opportunity that came out yesterday from AEMO, which indicated that there's an improved outlook on reliability since last year. No reliability gaps forecast under 28-29 in Victoria and 29-30 in New South Wales. And even then, reliability will be maintained by the pipeline of mix of generation, storage, and the new transmission projects coming on. So I guess I wonder, it's an open question to all the panelists, maybe starting with the Minister. I mean, do you see that as sort of reducing the urgency of the retailer reliability obligation as stated in the report? And I guess what's your view on how, you know, a lot of media headlines that this is just going to prop up coal and gas?
Sorry, I nearly knocked over my iPad. Look, I think, Paul, we know that we need to get new generation installed, new capacity installed, and we've got a mechanism to do that. But we also know we need to make sure that the existing infrastructure is able to keep operating until it's replaced. And my great fear is that it's going to start falling out much sooner than the AEMO report has predicted. You know, we're seeing a lot of, there's a lot of things that concern me, particularly around recent financial announcements with the year-end financial reporting process that would suggest that the existing coal-fired power stations are just not economically viable. And it goes to reason that those directors will be looking at those assets and determining whether or not they keep investing in you know, capital upgrades, that renew coal contracts, a whole range of things. So I'm greatly concerned about the early exit of coal. So there needs to be a mechanism to ensure that we do have that orderly transition, I think. So I guess to your point, Paul, you know, our challenge is not just one for the next few years, it's a challenge for the rest of the decade and the decade after that. We've got a plan to build pumped hydro. That will take up to 8 years. You know, building a whole res can take a similar time frame, let alone the transmission infrastructure that's going to be required to get those electrons into market. So we do need to have a plan to keep the existing stuff going until the new infrastructure is built. And I think they're hitting on the right issues. I'm not sure a physical RRO is the right way to do that. We want to see a contracting mechanism available. We think that would be a better way to deal with these things, but we're very happy to work in the process with the other states and territories to make sure we get the best solution for the overall NEM. And can I just say, I want to assure everyone that New South Wales will work very closely with the ESB and the other jurisdictions to try and to get to see some of the elements of the roadmap adopted more broadly across the NEM. So we think that you know, this could be a great solution for the NEM, not working against the NEM.
Yeah, and I should add that obviously Kerry Schott has made it very clear that, you know, that as it's designed, it is technology neutral, and then all of the detail around this and what it actually will do and the impact it will have needs to be worked out over the coming months. So, you know, it's just a proposal at this stage. But Simon, I wanted to just get your thoughts, and I want to bring you in on this as well. But just Simon, how do you, I mean, from your investor base point of view, how do you see a capacity market? Is that something you see as needed, or is going to go to some of the concerns that you've highlighted before?
Well, we've said previously, Paul, that the proposal as outlined in the ESB's papers at this point really only further clouds what is a quite uncertain investment environment for investors. I don't believe that we've comprehensively seen the case made out at this point. for a capacity market as proposed by the ESB, and to the Minister's point, in particular, whether it should be a physical mechanism or a financial mechanism. So we would say that this still needs further consideration, but it certainly only compounds the level of complexity that investors see in the market and uncertainty that they see in the market. And I think from many perspectives, that is really the critical issue. When you look at problems such as congestion, lack of access to transmission infrastructure, lack of access through the distribution networks, where that's an issue, issues around certainty, reasonable level of certainty around how much capacity can be dispatched. That is the primary issue from an investor perspective, and the PRRO really only compounds that already uncertain environment. So we would say that if ministers do believe that there is a problem that needs to be addressed here, that they need to give the ESB some very clear guardrails around what should and should not be on the table when it comes to the capacity mechanism. Otherwise, I fear that there could be other issues that start to enter the discussion. For example, would a capacity market mechanism not just be used to keep thermal generation open for a particular period, but would it also potentially allow for cost recovery of refurbishment in certain circumstances? There are all sorts of variations that could arise unless there's very clear guardrails put in place by ministers in terms of their response to the ESB recommendations.
And I don't know, I mean, obviously a capacity market, I guess, if and when it's introduced and how that looks, would go through more than probably just an AMC rule, I suspect, in a broader process. But I wanted to just see if you had any sort of thoughts on that from a sort of rulemaking perspective around, how that, I guess there's a consultation people will be going through anyway, but just any thoughts from you on that?
Yeah, that's right, Paul. Thanks. I mean, there is that point that it's currently under consideration by ministers, as Minister Keane pointed out, and the recommendation that the ESB has made is to go through a further detailed consultation and design phase using the PRRO as a starting point, because really what we want to do is think about that longer term future and what is it do we need by way of valuing capacity in a market as it transitions and then as it moves towards a market that's dominated by a fuel type which doesn't have a marginal cost to it. So it becomes a very different looking market, and that's why we think the idea of investigating how do we ensure that we have the right mix from time to time, and what is the best way of giving the certainty to investors of the return that they get from the market is something that is worth investigating carefully. From a rulemaker's perspective, I mean, I think it's a fundamental change to what we've got in one respect. The other respect I would like to say, it's about an adjunct to the energy market. Like, we're not talking about replacing it. And we've seen a number of international jurisdictions where you do see capacity and energy now working together, because they're both things of value that we need to reward participants for providing from time to time. Having said that, big change from what we've had for the last 20 years, we want to do it carefully and properly. And so the consultation and understanding the different perspectives is important. And in the report, we did note in particular what we'd heard from stakeholders in the consultation that we've done to date as being the critical issues that we thought would need that further investigation as we look at what a design might look like to take forward. So I think it's going to be a very important next 12 months, coming back to my earlier point around that collaboration and really understanding different perspectives and being able to balance those perspectives in a way that ultimately gets those best outcomes for customers.
Yeah, so
Paul, could I just pick up on another point that Simon made? I think that the point about having guardrails in place to guide the ESB is really important. Obviously, we're very supportive of making sure that we have a reliable grid, but we don't want New South Wales consumers to pay twice for the same infrastructure. Now, we've got, as I said, a legislated pathway to having that dispatchable capacity. We've got a clear plan to build 2 gigawatts of long duration storage by 2030, as well as additional firming if we need it to meet our energy security target here in New South Wales. So we'll continue to discuss this issue with the ESB in the detailed design process, so that if any changes do apply here in New South Wales, they integrate with the roadmap and don't charge consumers twice. But take the point, the last thing we want to do is cause more uncertainty for investors. The whole point of the roadmap is about lowering risk and the cost of capital to see that flow through to consumers and businesses in lower prices.
Well, you just answered my question. I was going to follow up, Minister, with exactly that point, whether we'd see any double paying of consumers. But I think there's an important point which concerns a few people. But let's now move to another theme. I want to pick up on transmission and access, because this, of course, is another key issue for many market participants, and goes particularly in some of the points Simon was making around the clean energy investor group principles. So I guess there's a few different aspects to this. Maybe to start off, Anna, can we talk a bit about the paper that's just been released by the AMC, I think it was last week or the week before, on the transmission review, which will focus on issues around the timely and efficient delivery of transmission investment, particularly large discrete projects identified in the ISP rather than the broader access regime. Keen to sort of understand what is the desired outcome from the review. Is there still a role for the RIT-T as it is in delivering large transmission infrastructure, or do you see a sort of a complete overhaul of the RIT-T through this through this review?
So I guess the starting point for the review, and I think Simon said it earlier, is that transmission will be the backbone of us moving to our net zero grid, because having that ability to move the energy around becomes increasingly important. So we're looking at once in a generation investment in transmission. And the last time we saw this level of investment was when transmission was owned by government. So it is a really different paradigm. And I also take Simon's point that the regulatory regime that we have, in so many respects, was designed to be incremental and to, in the case of transmission, to in some cases, put a lid on the investment as opposed to manage these significant scale investments that we need to see. And this review really builds on the work that's already been undertaken by the ESB. So in progressing the ISP so that we have that plan, in developing the rules for the actionable ISP so that we have that interaction between the RIT-T and the ISP. We've already moved along that spectrum of understanding the issues that arise with these really big investments, but we are starting to see some more emerge, and that's what we really want to have a look at in this review. In relation to the RIT-T, which you asked about specifically, I mean, we believe that there remains a critical role for robust assessment to make sure that customers are still getting the best value out of these investments. Like, we need to ensure that the money that's spent is in customers' best interest, because they'll be paying for it for the life of the assets. But is there ways in which the process or the substance can be improved? Absolutely. That's what we're kind of concerned about. So is the way that that process interacts with the ISP the most efficient way of going about it, or are we looking at the same issues twice? Have we got the right benefits? And I think the carbon benefit's a really interesting one, and we've raised that in our paper. Is that being taken into account in the right way in that assessment? And there's a range of other issues that we'll be looking at. The other thing that we're keen to do in this review is and what we're actually consulting on, is what are the priority issues? Because going back to my earlier comment about not wanting to wait until we've got everything perfect and then kind of launch it in 5 years' time, like, this is an issue now. So we want to be going, what's the first issue that we need to look at, and then do that one and get it in place quickly, and then move on to the next issue. And so actually the first thing we're asking stakeholders is, give us your sense of where are the priority issues. For example, is it around that RIT-T or the other issues that are raised in the paper?
Well, I mean, one of the issues that has been obviously a big concern is sort of around congestion and access issues, and I think that the ESB has a very explicit note in there about responding to concerns from the market around what was previously, I guess, the Kagati recommendation for location and marginal pricing. Just to clarify, does that mean that that's off the table, Kagati as location and marginal pricing as embodied in the Kagati proposals? Is that now off the table, as it were, from the ESB report?
Yeah. So I think the ESB report's clear, is that Kagati is not part of the recommendations. We've recommended a different model. Where I think we are on congestion is, somebody said people have been trying to find the answer to transmission access for the last 20 years since the NEM started. So it's one of the thorniest issues there is. But I think, again, with that changing generation mix, and Simon has also raised it, that issue of congestion has become heightened. And so I think we have now an alignment around the problem to be solved, which is a great starting point. I think there's still quite different perspectives about the way of going about that. And we see two things that we're trying to solve through the model that we've put forward. One is getting generation built in the right spot. So the renewable energy zone work that's being done by the jurisdictions, like that's where we want generators to build. So having the right signals that say this is the best place to build is important. And then once we've got not just generation, but this extends to batteries and also looking further into the future load, such as hydrogen, which can provide great benefits to the market. How do we make sure that they're being rewarded for responding in the right way to what's needed from time to time? So it's got both that locational investment aspect to it, as well as trying to make sure that the price signals in the moment are what we need them to be. So that's what we've put forward. Again, it's something that's subject to consideration by ministers at the moment as to whether we move forward with that proposal. And as I said, I know there's a lot of different views, and we'll be really keen to engage with stakeholders to understand further from that model that's now on the table where the thinking is.
Maybe just before I turn to Matt and Simon on that, just quickly, so everyone sort of understands, I guess the model in a nutshell, as I understand it, is all generations would pay a congestion charge calculated on a per megawatt hour basis for the generator's marginal impact on the cost of intra-regional congestion for that dispatch interval. But then eligible generators would receive a rebate, which is largely intended to correlate with that charge. So it sort of becomes mostly cost neutral. I think at the moment, eligible generators could include incumbent generators, so there'd be some grandfathering, as would, I guess, be important in the market, and the notion of res foundational participants. So I guess there's a lot of design elements here that would have to be worked through, as is clear. Just keen to sort of bring in maybe, Anna, just a question back to you, and then I'd like to get the ministers and Simon's response on that. But what do you see as some of the most critical policy decisions and sort of design elements around that to work through the model that's been put on the table?
So I think the first one is, as I think you've described it very well, Paul, that question of eligibility for the rebate, because that's the really important part about sending signals about where we want generators to locate. That's for new generation. So that's a really important thing to think carefully about. Starting point is renewable energy zones, but I think there are other factors that will be important to take into account there. So, for example, one that's been raised is, well, where you've got plenty of transmission capacity, for example, if you have an incumbent retire, then would that be sort of another candidate for a rebate, so that, because that's, you're encouraging generation to locate there. So I think that idea of where the rebates sit is one of the most important policy questions. And I think the other one is, it really goes to, I guess, the fundamental of, well, what's the impact of generation that locates outside because they feel that there's better other factors that would lead them to want to do that. And how does that kind of impact those investment decisions? And I think that's something that I'm sure Simon will have thoughts on.
Minister, what's your view on this? Because I guess I know at the moment your department's busy writing a lot of access rules and regime for the reses. So keen to get your thoughts on this.
Well, as Anna said, transmission's fundamental to building a modern grid, and whilst the existing rules served us well for small upgrades over the past years, they're no longer fit for purpose for the big transmission projects, which we know we're going to need. That's why under the roadmap, we created a bespoke regime that gets the res transmission built on time so generators can connect with confidence. It's why we've got the ability to open up the build of this stuff to contestability. I need to make sure that HumeLink is built to get the snowy capacity into the grid in time for the closure of Vales Point and Araring and Bayswater that is, on the near-term horizon. So we've given ourselves the powers to do those things. But for the next round of ISP interconnector projects, I think the AEMC's project process is going to be absolutely critical. With regard to access, we recognise congestion as a primary barrier holding investment back. That's why we're applying a clear access regime to our RES, which will give investors upfront confidence in their access rights so that they can conduct the due diligence on their investment. So these are issues that, that we're working through. We've got complete confidence in Anna. We're working very closely with her, and we see it as fundamental to setting us up for success. We think that that our access regime that I talked about will be able to integrate well with the congestion management model that's being proposed by the ESB, which is far simpler than the earlier COGATI reforms.
Simon, can you get your thoughts from your members' views on the congestion management model?
Yeah, I think, Paul, the congestion management model remains the issue of greatest concern to Clean Energy Investor Group members. The reason for that is that whilst the ESB has properly identified the problem, which is how do you manage access in the NEM outside of RESs, and how do you deal with congestion in that context, they continue to rely on a locational marginal pricing mechanism to inform the way that mechanism operates. And we say that LMPs as a framework are mechanisms that are designed to deliver dispatch efficiency, and they're very good at doing that, but they're less effective at allowing investors to be able to predict revenues with any reasonable level of certainty. So there's just, you can't rely on that 5-minute pricing interval to draw long-term conclusions about what revenues are going to look like over time. And equally, you can't predict who will join and when within that particular area, and what that means in terms of grid availability moving forward. So from our perspective, we would say that this is an opportunity for ministers to, again, give some guardrails to the ESB in their consideration of the ESB's recommendations by saying, look, CMM as a model should continue to be developed. There should continue to be development of understanding what open access looks like in a reformed NEM and how congestion is managed. But anything that relies on an LNP framework or basis as part of its, as one of its inputs should be ruled out and should not be on the table, because investors have said very, very clearly that approach just makes it extremely difficult to predict revenues with any reasonable level of certainty. And that means cost of equity, cost of capital is going to be higher. So whilst the problem identification is right and the adjustments the ESB have sought to make are a step in the right direction, the reliance on LNPs in terms of the foundational basis on which that mechanism continues to operate should be stripped out and further work be given, further work requested of the ESB with those guardrails, if you like, in place.
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge is if as Anna says, the idea is to have a price signal, then from a design point of view, it's hard to see how you can do this in a way that doesn't include some locational differences. But I think that's obviously a key policy point. I don't know, Anna, did you want to have any further response to that? I think otherwise we're going to sort of start opening up to questions. I see we've got about almost 100 questions here on the chat and Q&A function, but I don't know if there's any sort of final comments from anyone before I throw it open to questions via Giles.
Well, I was just keen to add on transmission and the regulatory investment test framework. We really welcome the work that's been announced by the AMC in this regard. It is important that we fundamentally reform the way investment test frameworks operate for transmission. And in particular, we recognise that there needs to be reforms, not just in the longer term, but in the short term, to get certain projects moving. And I'm really pleased to hear the Minister highlight the importance of HumeLink and VNI West, obviously opening up the capacity of Snowy to be able to deliver its benefits into the market is contingent on really a resolution of a problem that comes ahead of the broader AEMC reforms package. And that's not just about Snowy itself, but it's also about the new renewable energy projects that will be enabled by Snowy in terms of the offtake arrangements between Snowy and new wind and solar farms. So we would strongly encourage New South Wales Government to continue to work with the federal government on resolving the issues around HumeLink and BNI West. It's critically important to enable new build renewables, as well as to enable Snowy 2 itself, whilst there's a continuation of the reform progress that the AEMC has outlined.
Giles, hand over to you. You can start going through some of the questions. I see we've got quite a few there.
My old age problem, I can never find the unmute button, but there you go. Yes, we have got quite a few questions here, and thank you very much for everyone sending them in. A whole bunch of them are on chat, but at the moment I'm looking on the Q&A one. So if you put your questions on chat, then kind of shift it over to Q&A because I can actually find them in the right place. But I'm going to go through a couple of questions for each of the panelists and then hand back to Paul, who can go through some of the questions now. Anna, a lot of the questions have been about the environmental objective. Just briefly explain, why don't we have one, and how hard and how different does it make the rulings that the AEMC makes, the fact that there is not one?
As to why it's not there, actually, that we'd have to go back into the annals of time to understand what the drafters were thinking originally. But I guess in the 1990s, they felt that economics and environment were two different things, which is different to how we think about it now.
Shame on them.
From the AEMC's perspective, and I know that each of the market bodies actually feel differently about this, but we look at the context in which we're making our decisions. We need to act in the best interest of long-term interest of customers. Like, we can see that all of our jurisdictions now have a form of net zero target, and that is the context in which all of our decisions are being made. So we are working towards enabling that. I think the difference would be that the AEMC doesn't see itself as driving that, but we see that the jurisdictional policies have been now put in place to do so. So for us, when I think about the work we're doing in essential system services, for example, it's all being based on the fact that we've got this transitioning grid, and we want to ensure that it transitions in a way that best meets the needs of customers from a reliability and security perspective. So while I think having it there would certainly enhance our ability to do that, and I think it makes probably more of a difference, as I said, to some of the decisions that are made by our counterparts, we really feel like that is the direction in which all our decisions are heading in any case.
Let's hope so. Look, another question for you, and then straight over to the Minister, I think. A lot of questions about the capacity markets and the way they've been framed. So I've got like a two-part question, which kind of summarises what people are saying. One, were you a bit disappointed in the way that the capacity markets are often portrayed in the media? It's essentially, let's keep coal there because, strangely enough, it might be good for renewables, but it seemed to be all about payments for coal plants. And a lot of people are suggesting, to what extent can they be based not so much around capacity, but in response time and ramping rates. I think what they're talking about there is a flexibility market. Have we got the terminology wrong in the first place and the descriptions wrong? And to what extent do your proposals allow for it to be more focused on the flexibility side of things, new technologies, or the capacity, which is the old technologies?
That's a really interesting way of thinking about it and articulating it. I hadn't thought of that before. So yes, I think the ESB report is very clear that this is around that transition to net zero and getting the right mix of technology so that we have a secure and reliable system. And it's the complement to the variable renewables that are most important. And so some of the work that we've also been doing at the AEMC in relation to an operating reserve, which is the thing that will organise resources in real time, has been looking at what are the kind of resources that we need in the market, and that would feed into then how are we designing our capacity mechanism so that we have that right mix of resources. So I do find it that a sort of a black and white view of it is perhaps unhelpful, because I think what we're doing is more complex than that. And I do think it's looking to that future and designing something that's going to help us move there and then operate in that future state.
Well, Minister, because you said earlier that you're a bit worried about losing some of your coal capacity earlier than you would have thought. But can we have a mechanism? How do you actually sort of strike then a mechanism that does a bit of both? Rewards, keeps coal in for as long as you need to rally the troops and get everything built, but also to actually provide that incentive for new investment, all those technologies. I mean, you have your own particular roadmap and maybe you'll have to go it alone. I guess other states don't necessarily have that. And as a nation, as a national grid, we have to push forward to encourage those new technologies and not favour the existing ones overly much.
Well, Giles, as I said, we've got a mechanism to ensure that we get the new infrastructure built to encourage investment in New South Wales. What we don't have is a mechanism to ensure that we have an orderly transition. And to answer your question, I think what we need is some kind of ability to directly negotiate with the owners of existing assets, like the Victorian government did with your lawn, to ensure that we all get certainty about what the time horizon is with regard to the closure. So I think in the current environment, the best way to keep the existing stuff in is not a market mechanism. It would be a direct contract or that would facilitate a managed exit of that plant.
I interpret that as saying that you're not really in favour of the PRRO, which I think you've actually said. So you'll do a Victoria type deal and let's move on with those new type of markets, like a flexibility type market then.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to preempt where the energy ministers might land, but to use Simon's language, I've provided some pretty clear guardrails to the ESB when designing up what New South Wales would like to see happen.
I see Trevor St. Baker's on the line. He's the part owner of Vales Point, so maybe you can both send me a number and we can kind of work it out before the webinar's over.
Well, he's a great fan of mine. I mean, you know, he bet on Mark Latham as the guy that could stymie the energy roadmap, and he failed. So I'm not going to be in the pocket of vested interest like Trevor St. Baker. My role is to make decisions in the community interest, and let me tell you what's in the community interest in New South Wales: getting access to the cheapest form of reliable, clean energy in the world, and that's what our roadmap is going to achieve.
Okay, I was actually quite serious that Trevor was on the line, and he's got a question for you, Simon, which is, why are you saying that there should not be a premium on capital for renewable investment in Australia, when Australia already has a 5 times per capita uptake of solar and wind than any other comparable interconnected electricity supply system?
Well, I just don't, as a group, we would say, Giles, that we don't believe that in the Australian market, development of solar and wind should be more expensive than it is in other comparable markets. And the reason for that is that this is a competitive global environment. Our members deploy their funds across multiple economies and they make judgments every day about whether or not an investment in a wind farm in the US should be given priority, for example, over a development of a wind farm in Australia. If the cost of capital is higher, if the cost of equity is higher, and therefore the risk is higher in the Australian market, then they will make a judgment about what is the most suitable place to invest their funds. And as an investor group, we don't want Australia to miss out. We don't want Australia to miss out on the level of investment it requires, and we don't want consumers to be paying more than they should for the transformation that has to occur. So for all of those reasons, Giles, that's why we say what we say around cost of capital and cost of equity. Let's be really clear. There's an enormous rebuild that has to occur in the NEM. If you look at the step change scenario, which our members have said is the best scenario from their perspective when it comes to planning for transition, there is around 50 gigawatts of new build wind and solar that has to be built between now and around 2040. At the moment, there's only 3 gigawatts of projects committed in terms of commitment from investors to proceed in the NEM. So that is an enormous gap of 48 odd gigawatts that still needs to be built. And we're not going to get it built unless investors can deploy funds with confidence and unless we can reduce the cost premium, the risk premium that investors are currently experiencing, which is causing them to increasingly prioritise other markets over the Australian market.
I'll throw back quickly to the Minister before giving it back to Paul. You've had two enormous responses to your renewable energy zone EOIs, 27 gigawatts, I think, in the Central West, 34 in New England. I mean, that's, there's 60 gigawatts, probably all in two places. With this interest, are you proposing to possibly fast track the rollout of some of the other renewable energy zones? What can you do to seize upon that, that enormous amount of supply?
Well, I think people are voting with their feet, as we saw. I mean, recently the Central West Renewable Energy Zone, or the New England Renewable Energy Zone, was oversubscribed 8 times. I mean, a lot of the naysayers were saying, oh, we're scaring off investment. Well, quite the opposite. So yes, I think we want to take advantage of this opportunity, and that brings me to the opportunity that Project Energy Connect presents, which has just been approved. That'll enable us to potentially fast track the opening up of the Southwest Renewable Energy Zone as well, and bring that renewable energy into the market far sooner than we're envisaging. So to Simon's point, we've got a plan to get 12 gigawatts built. We're still short of the 50 that the NEM's going to require, but the rate we're going, and with the, I guess, the speed at which the other states are moving in this, and looking at Queensland potentially, we could really capitalise and see a lot more investment, infrastructure, opportunities and jobs coming into New South Wales as a result of the policy settings that we've put in place.
Paul, do you have some questions that you've plucked from the inbox there?
Yeah, so one of the questions actually is picked up on the electricity supply outlook, and it talks about, I guess, the minimum demand over the next 5 years is going to lead to some issues, particularly with the high uptake of renewables. Well, sorry, rooftop PV specifically. And I guess the question, maybe this is for you, Simon, is how will the sector attract long-term investment with the combination of these forecasts, the gigawatts that are already coming online in the next 5 years, and uncertain retirement dates for traditional generators? I guess I should add that the AEMO's outlook does talk about EVs and hydrogen as new medium-term loads, of course, that will change that.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. And this is an important question, but not one where we would say that it's an either-or proposition. Clearly, the uptake of distributed energy resources is a trend that is only going to continue as households take advantage of low technology costs to themselves achieve lower electricity bills in terms of their own household consumption. And indeed, commercial and industrial users will continue to do that as well. But what we're talking about is not just the residential market. We're also talking about large elements of the market which are reliant on grid-supplied electricity, particularly industrial users and the very large commercial users. Combined, they are the largest component of the NEM. So we would say that there will continue to need to be very significant investment in utility scale generation to meet the requirements, particularly of a decarbonising economy and the electrification of significant parts of the economy, including, as you highlight in the ESO conclusions from AEMO, EVs, hydrogen manufacture, but also electrification of significant parts of industry that currently rely on other energy sources. So these combined really highlight the fact that we will continue to need very significant build out of new build utility scale, in addition to the ongoing upward trend of DER, particularly in the household sector.
A question, I think this one's for you, Minister. There's a question here around, has anyone thought about the interaction of RESs, especially New South Wales model, and the capacity market? This could play out many ways with windfall gains from double dipping. Or does the New South Wales scheme bring so much capacity, especially storage and pumped hydro, into the market that the capacity mechanism won't have much of a role to play in New South Wales?
Well, Minister Taylor makes that pitch to me that we shouldn't need the capacity, and that's why we should push ahead with supporting a physical RRO. I am concerned about New South Wales consumers having to pay twice. So we're making decisions based on what's in the interests of New South Wales consumers. And right now, we think that the roadmap, the legislative pathway to have that capacity will be enough to cover our needs, provided we get a mechanism that sees the orderly transition from the existing generators. Could I just go back to a point that from earlier from Simon? I think Giles was asking from one of the questioners. We want as many RESs declared in New South Wales as possible. And the reason is very clear. We want as much competition as we can get between all the different RES projects for LTESs, because that's in consumers' interest. That's in businesses' interest. If we can get the price down as low as possible for household bills and businesses, that is a win-win-win for everyone. That's what the game plan is here. Could I also say something? I gave a little shout out to my friend Trevor St. Baker. I wasn't specifically singling him out. I was singling out the owners of existing generation, Origin, Energy Australia, all these forces combined to try and block the roadmap because they didn't want more competition in the market. Well, I say competition is a good thing. I say competition is in the interests of consumers, and that's been borne out by what we're seeing with the demand for LTESs, the oversubscription of our renewable energy zones, and ultimately it will see us build a modern grid that will drive down prices, keep the lights on, and enable our industry to compete in a low carbon global environment.
Thanks, Minister. I've got one more question here. I might hand back to you, Giles. Maybe one or two left in the time we've got. I think, Anna, this is probably for you. There's a question here about higher costs of entry, making it harder for renewable providers to enter the market in the future, particularly around the grid costs. And I just want to sort of check, is that something that part of the transmission review in terms of, you know, the costs that are charged to generators and how that's borne by generators in particular?
I think it might be also directed towards connection process, and there's a really excellent piece of work underway at the moment with AEMO partnering with the Clean Energy Council, who have been unpacking the issues that have arisen for renewable energy generators as they've gone through that connection process. And, you know, as it gets more and more complex, so from shouldn't speak on behalf of my market body colleagues, but each time there's a new renewable energy generator connects to the NEM, it's a new NEM. And so AEMO's role in keeping the system secure is something that goes into the work that is done in order to go through that process. But, you know, very cognizant from the developer's perspective of trying to find that certainty and get that system working better. And so we've been participating in that to understand the type of work that's going on. And I think there'll be a mix of solutions that start to emerge, which range from the way in which AEMO goes about the process to some potential rule changes, which may come up with different ways of thinking about how you go about doing that in the very different circumstances that we have now, again, to when the rules were first written. And you didn't have like such a large number of generators seeking to connect in the same place at the same time. So there's a lot of work that's being undertaken, but that's separate to our review, but we're very involved and conscious of how they would work together.
Yeah, and one of the things that struck me reading the ESB's report, in fact, I think it's the last recommendation, is obviously there's a lot of extra work for the AMC and AEMO and other bodies. And I think it obviously a recommendation around budgetary requirements to manage all of that. So that's obviously, I just think of the workload as you describe it across all of those is going to be significantly increased. So there's a big issue there around resourcing and budget. I'll hand back to Giles, see if you've picked up a few more questions from the questions.
The unmute button again. Minister, a lot of interest from your comments about sort of talking to individual coal generators. Might you consider a German-style capacity withdrawal auction?
Well, everything's on the table, Giles. I'm not going to play rule in, rule out games here today. All I'm saying is that we know the challenge ahead. We saw with Yallourn that you know, I mean, every coal generator is different, right? They've got different coal contracts, they've got different capital upgrade cycles, they've got different marginal costs, like a whole range of stuff. So a one-size-fits-all approach, I don't think, is the answer. You're going to need a bespoke solution or a tailored solution for every different scenario. So I'm conscious of that. I want the coal-fired power stations to continue operating as long as they can. But I'm also aware of the reality that the economics are changing. You know, investor risk is changing. There's a whole range of factors that are putting pressure on coal. So the influx of newer, cheaper forms of energy generation. So I guess I'm not an expert on German policy, but I'm happy to look into it. I don't speak German, but the one thing that Germany is doing very well is supporting those coal communities through diversification. And, you know, I think Germany's leading the way on a whole range of fronts, including hydrogen. We should look to them for a number of things, and we'll certainly have a look and see if that would suit us in New South Wales.
One final question for you, Anna, before I just finish up maybe with just a question for everyone, which might be what you might do if you're a federal energy minister for a day, so you can start thinking about that. Anna, there's a question here about voltage controls and how to incentivize the network to actually improve the voltage level and power quality. It has actually been a major issue because it kind of feeds through the whole system. It raises issues and all the things that you're doing with distributed energy and sort of creating rules and regulations around that. Is there anything specific that you're thinking of there?
So I'm thinking of both transmission and distribution. So in distribution, the rule that we made recently, which was around reforming distribution network businesses' obligations to provide an export service, and having that service being regulated in the same way that their traditional service is provided. I think that does go towards the way they manage their voltage, in terms of they're now not just directed to ensuring that customers receive their electricity, but also they have to actually provide a service so that customers can get their electricity onto the grid. So I think that's part of that, will be the way in which they then go about upgrading their grids to manage that from that perspective. I think the other main piece of work that we're doing in relation to the transmission network is around system strength and shifting from the current do no harm regime to a regime where we have the transmission companies taking that long-term perspective of what's needed within their area to manage system strength. And so to kind of look at that from a holistic perspective and build it into the planning, as well as then working on the generation standards. That makes it, going back to the question from Paul before about connection, easier for the generators to know what the rules are, so when they connect, they can more easily kind of get through that process. So those are the two things that we're working on from a transmission and distribution perspective.
Okay. So Simon, you've been an energy minister in Canberra, sadly just for the ACT, not for Australia, but what would you do if you're federal energy minister for a day? Or in other words, what would be your most pressing point if you were in that position?
Thanks, Charles. It's always a pleasure to come from the other Canberra rather than the one we hear referenced in the media all the time. But what I would do first and foremost is agree that we have to have a plan for transition of the sector with a clear target around when the NEM needs to be decarbonised. And that needs to align with the science, that needs to align with what global markets are looking for in terms of the actions of advanced economies. And that means a scenario like the step change scenario should be an agreed objective. Once we've done that, then the key thing that I would highlight is we need to unlock the blockage that we currently see in terms of commitments to invest. And the way we need to focus on that is to deliver revenue certainty. We need to deliver revenue certainty in design markets so that investors can, as the Minister says, do their due diligence and anticipate what is going to be a reasonable expectation around revenues over the long-term life of the project to enable them to build the transmission and generation infrastructure we need to achieve that step change scenario. Those would be the two key things that I would be saying to states we would have to collectively work together on.
Mr. McKean, you've been promoted from New South Wales to Australia. What are you going to do?
I think that would be too controversial for me to answer this as a member of the Liberal Party. But one thing that we do need to do is get on with building the new infrastructure in a way before the existing stuff comes to the end of its technical life. And we need to do that right across the NEM. Now, different states and territories have different needs. So Queensland, they're a bit further behind where we are in New South Wales, simply because their current sources of generation are younger. That said, in order to get to net zero, that we're all going to have to move there. So it'd be best, what I would do if I was to move to Canberra, I would be focusing on having a nationally coordinated approach to generation, transmission, and capacity. That's what I think is needed. I'd be trying to stop the fragmentation of the NEM as it currently stands, and I'd be trying to build a coalition in the manner we did in New South Wales, bringing together Labor, Greens, Nationals and Liberals to legislate change that will give investors the certainty that they need to proceed with projects. That hasn't happened because of the lack of stable policy at the national level, and it's about time we got it.
Thank you very much. And it might be a little less comfortable for you to sort of imagine yourself as a politician and a minister, but feel free to do so. Or perhaps there's possibly a rule that you're busting to put through as chair of the AMC that you haven't done so yet.
Maybe as representative of my market body colleagues, like we really appreciate the value of the NEM as a whole. So the reason that it was put together in the first place is that interconnectedness between all the jurisdictions and the benefits that provides customers. And so very cognizant of different jurisdictions being in different places and wanting to accommodate those objectives, but fundamentally, as we're all interconnected, seeing that real value in having that national approach. So I think that's a little bit repetitive of what Simon and the Minister have said, but that's... there's a theme running through here and it's not a bad one, so that's very good. Look, I'm just going to hand back to Paul, but just from my point of view, thank you very much to all the panellists, the Minister, Simon and Anna for joining the panel, and back to you, Paul, just to wrap up.
Yeah, thanks, Giles, and I agree. Thank you very much. That was a really interesting discussion. We're going to wrap it up here. I was trying to find the little clap button, but I can't seem to find it on Zoom. That must have been the other ones we used. But thanks to the Minister, to Simon and Anna for participating and giving us so much generosity in your time and the contribution to debate. I think it's clear that we're only just starting through the process of a lot of really important engagement. And I think we look forward to that ongoing consultation and working collaboratively. So thanks again for joining. I might just mention then that we are running the next in our series on energy transformed. We've got a battery podcast coming up in a couple of weeks. And following that, we're going to be tackling net zero, looking then sort of at corporates in particular and their role in net zero ambition in the energy sector. So please stay tuned for further information on those and join us in those ongoing discussions. So with that, I'd like to thank again the panelists, thank all of my colleagues at ASHA who've been working behind the scenes and those at Renew Economy to make this happen. And thanks for joining our Energy Transformed webinar series, NEM Reform, Who Rules the Market? Thanks very much.
Thank you.